Hi. I was wondering if there was a timeline about phasing out subsidies on fossil fuels.
Well, thank you for the question, because I think we too agree it's one of the most important outcomes of this summit. What the G20 agreed to do was first set the goal of reducing fossil fuel subsidies. The timeline that is referred to is in the medium term. So it's not next week, and it's not 2050. It's going to depend a bit on each country's plans. And then we've created a process in terms of how to move this forward. So we've asked ministers, the relevant ministers of each country, to come back and to report back at the next meeting on what timetable in the medium term is most appropriate for their country to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Some countries are already well underway. One country that has already done a great deal in this regard is Indonesia, which had very large subsidies. It took up a significant portion of GDP. And over time, they've been transitioning from blanket subsidies to targeted subsidies for the poor, cash transfers to the poor, to make sure that people in need were able to access energy, but that they didn't distort the market price overall. And other countries are beginning to look at that and to follow suit. So that's the process. It will take some time, and again, each country will be different. They each face their own national circumstances, and in many countries, energy subsidies are a key part of social policy, and so they want to be careful in terms of how they transition off it and making sure that they are providing the necessary subsidies to the poor at the same time that they're getting off the blanket subsidies.
I wonder if you could say a few words about climate finance and what happened in the communique when the language on new and additional financing dropped out. Can you give us some insight? Tricia Lerner from Greenpeace International.
Welcome. As you may recall, in July at the meeting of the Major Economies Forum, the President asked the Major Economies Forum leaders to agree to ask the G20 finance ministers to work on climate finance. And the theory being that if we're heading towards a system in which large sums of money are going to be transferred from one part of the world to another, it was important and useful to get our finance people involved. There was some very good work done by working groups of the finance channel over that period of time. The finance ministers had some discussion of this at their meeting earlier this month in London. And the agreement that came out of today was to ask them to continue their work towards their next meeting, which is in November, to develop further options that could provide input into the UN FCCC negotiations.
Hi, this is from the internet. So there's Nagalopoulos, I think he's a tag here, and they're asking what good is regulation without an enforcement regime?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
What good is regulation for climate without an enforcement regime?
What good is regulation for climate?
Yeah, in terms of emissions, I think this is what they mean is in terms of emissions without any enforcement regime.
Well, look, all those sorts of issues are being dealt with in the UN negotiations, whether it's the mitigation, adaptation, financing, or technology, are all part of the UN FCCC negotiations, including the issue of monitoring, reporting, and verifying actions. And so while there are issues around international enforcement, there are always issues of international enforcement around international agreements. There are discussions of monitoring, reporting, and verification regimes with regard to climate that will be an important part of making sure that countries are doing what they commit to.
Hi, Mike Aldenmeyer, Union of Concerned Scientists. I wanted to come back on the climate finance issue because obviously I think the President did raise some expectations on that at the very last minute in L'Aquila with putting this on the agenda here. If you look at the evolution of the text over the course of the week, it was sort of the incredible shrinking text to the point where the final declaration dropped even the broad principles that had been in the penultimate text and just had the direction to finance ministers. And I guess if you can just say a little bit about the issue of trust between the leaders on this issue and sort of building confidence going into Copenhagen. What reassurance can you give us that the U.S., Japan, Europe can build some understandings and come forward either before the Scotland finance ministers meeting or at least before Copenhagen with a credible finance package which will rebuild some of the trust among these leaders and give us a springboard on this key element of the deal, because it looks like it's going in the wrong direction from what happened to the text.
Well, of course, you weren't supposed to see early drafts of the communique until it's actually finished and released. So I don't want to encourage that sort of behavior going forward. But let me just say the following: the U.S. has been, since you did see early versions of the text, then you know that the U.S. draft has been strong in terms of proposing a series of principles that we thought could be useful in terms of adding to the negotiations in Copenhagen. And I think there were a number of countries that supported that approach. There were some countries that didn't, and some of the emerging economies felt uncomfortable with those principles and insisted that they be taken out. And the way the G20 works is if you can't reach a consensus, then you can't move forward on those issues. So you saw the best that we could get in the limited time that we had, but we aren't giving up, and we hope to continue to build on that.
Todd Lucier from Canada, Climate Cafe in Canada. You're coming to our backyard in June of 2009 with
Muskoka.
the G20 to the Muskoka area. And this is quite an interesting change. I was sort of crestfallen. The G8's not coming to Muskoka. Now the G20 is coming to Muskoka. It's quite exciting. This is quite a forum, quite a scale of 20 leaders, the kind of volume of people that you've got to be able to talk about issues like climate change and have really valid, rich communications. And it's efficient. It seems to me it's an efficient size group to communicate, as opposed to the very large dynamic that exists with the United Nations format. Can you talk a little bit about the type of conversations, the types of issues that were addressed over lunch and informally that didn't find their way into the communique, that give us some hope that this 90% of the world's economy, these leaders, are actually moving forward in their dialogue?
Well, let me first say, to take up your overall point, this is quite a remarkable development. The G20 did not exist 11 months ago at the leaders' level. There's been 3 summits since, and at the end of those 3 summits, we've agreed that it, rather than the G8, will be the center of international economic cooperation going forward. That's actually a rather remarkable shift. And when you add to that the actions that were taken with regard to the IMF and the World Bank and shifting voice and vote in there from largely industrialized countries to largely emerging economies, it reflects that there is a tectonic shift going on in international cooperation, international economic governance, reflecting the role that the major emerging economies and developing countries are playing in the global economy more generally. So in these groups, there's always a balance to be struck between inclusiveness, legitimacy, and diversity on one hand, and efficiency on the other hand. And we think the G20 strikes a pretty good balance of having 80+% of the world's economy, 80% plus of the world's population, 80% plus of the world's emissions, all sitting around the table, reflecting both advanced industrialized and developing countries, and seeing whether we can work together to resolve these issues that no one group of countries can resolve on their own.
Jean-Marc Mangin with the Tick 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 campaign. Prime Minister Harper is being quoted in The Guardian right now that President Obama said that we should not view Copenhagen as a make or break on climate change, and therefore Harper is not planning to go to Copenhagen. The Tick 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 is calling for head of state to go to Copenhagen so we can have a fair, ambitious, and binding treaty, a FAB deal. If not now, when?
Well, I think, as I said, the leaders had an extensive discussion of this issue. We'll continue to have discussions, and I think there was a broad agreement that their personal involvement with their teams and with each other will be important as part of reaching a successful conclusion in these negotiations. So I think they're very much engaged in this process, and we'll have to see how that work progresses. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.